It all started with a splash. Not the kind you expect to hear in the middle of a peaceful Sunday afternoon, but the kind that makes you freeze mid-step, wondering what just violated your quiet suburban sanity. I had barely walked out of the kitchen with a tray of lemonade when I saw Karen, the HOA vice president, flailing her way across my private backyard pool like she owned the place. No invitation, no knock. Just her, in some oversized floppy sun hat and a blinding neon pink one-piece, diving straight into my water as if she paid for it. What made it worse was the smug smile she flashed me when she surfaced, like she had done me a favor. "It's too hot not to swim," she called out, like it was the most normal thing in the world. That moment marked the beginning of the most absurd week of my life, one that spiraled from simple trespassing into full-on HOA warfare, police involvement, and an epic neighborhood reckoning that no one saw coming. And if you've ever dealt with a Karen who thinks the rules apply to everyone but her, you're going to want to hear how this ended. So grab your drink, sit back, and subscribe to Sham Stories on YouTube, because this true tale of suburban entitlement is just getting started. Let me rewind a bit. I had moved into the Willowbrook Trails community less than a year ago. It was a gated neighborhood, well-maintained, peaceful, and advertised as the ideal escape from urban chaos. My backyard was my sanctuary large, surrounded by a high privacy fence, and equipped with a beautiful pool I'd saved up for years to install. It was the one luxury I had promised myself, and no HOA rulebook made any mention of restrictions on pool use as long as safety guidelines were followed. The trouble was Karen. From the moment I arrived, she made herself known, not in the friendly welcome to the neighborhood way, but in the clipboard-wielding, passive-aggressive comment-dropping, self-appointed enforcer type. She was the vice president of the HOA, but in her mind, she might as well have been the mayor. The first warning sign came when she walked up to my property during my first week and pointed at my mailbox. "That shade of gray doesn't match the rest of the community," she said. "You'll need to repaint it within 10 days. I smiled politely, but something told me this wouldn't be our last encounter. I followed the rule, but that one demand turned into 10 more grass length, flag positioning, how long my trash bin stayed curbside. Each request came with a sugary sweet tone and a hollow smile. I played along, not wanting to rock the boat. But then came Pool Sunday. That particular weekend had been brutal, temperatures nearing 100, humidity thick as syrup. I'd invited my cousin Lisa and her family over for lunch and a dip. We were just setting up in the backyard when Karen, uninvited and unnoticed, slipped through my side gate, towel over shoulder, and simply climbed up to the diving board like she belonged there. Lisa froze mid-sentence. Her kids stared wide-eyed. I managed to find my voice. "Karen, what are you doing?" She didn't even look guilty. "Oh, you know how it is," she said. "My AC's on the fritz, and I figured with that big pool of yours you wouldn't mind sharing for a bit." I blinked. "You didn't ask." "You're part of the community," she replied cheerfully. "This is a communal spirit kind of place. This is private property," I said more firmly, walking toward her. "And you're trespassing." She just laughed and dove in. The splash hit my feet. I was stunned, and so was Lisa. Karen swam to the edge, smoothed back her hair, and added, "Don't be so uptight. I'll only be a few minutes." At that point, I asked her to leave, politely, directly. She refused. She said, "As an HOA board member, I have oversight authority for neighborhood wellness. And considering the heat, this falls under wellness." That's when I realized something bigger was going on. Karen wasn't just pushy. She genuinely believed her title gave her a right to violate private space. I didn't want a scene with Lisa's kids watching, so I let her finish her ridiculous swim. She toweled off, helped herself to a cold drink from our cooler like it was a public vending machine, and only then strutted back out through the side gate with a smug, "See you at the next HOA meeting." I thought it was over. I thought she'd gotten her little attention fix and would move on. But the next morning, there was a printed notice taped to my front door with HOA letterhead. It read, "Due to community feedback and ongoing environmental strain, personal pools may be subject to temporary shared access. The board will be discussing rotation schedules for community comfort." I stared at it in disbelief. It wasn't signed. No names, no official stamp. Just a bold attempt to turn my backyard into a public pool without my consent. Photo crumpled it up and called the HOA office. Of course, no one picked up. So I wrote an email to the entire board demanding clarification. That afternoon, I received a reply not from the president, not from a secretary, but from Karen herself. She wrote in the spirit of neighborly cooperation. Your pool's availability could alleviate heat-related stress in the community. Your refusal to consider this reflects poorly on your standing. She even quoted a line from the community. Guidelines about collaborative use of amenities in emergency conditions, which, by the way, referred to snowblowers and lawn tools, nothing about pools. I replied with a cease and desist message, warned of trespassing, and told her to stay off my property. The next day I installed a coded lock on the side gate, but it didn't stop her. That Friday evening, after I returned from the store, I noticed wet footprints around the pool deck. The gate was locked, but somehow someone had been there. I checked the camera I'd installed near the patio door, and sure enough, at 2:10 p.m., Karen appeared on the footage, climbing over my 6-foot wooden fence using a folding step stool and lowering herself into my backyard like some entitled burglar in a sun hat. She swam for 20 minutes, sipped from a drink she took from my patio fridge, then climbed out and left the same way. I was fuming. That was no misunderstanding. That was a break-in. The next morning, I called the local police department and filed a trespassing report. I showed them the video. The officer's eyes widened. You really did climb over your fence. He said, that's criminal trespass, not just civil. He took the report seriously. But when I gave Karen a heads up that the police would likely speak to her, she laughed again. I'll tell them it was a misunderstanding. I thought I was invited. We're all neighbors. You'll look petty. I didn't care. The video spoke for itself. And that night, I sent the footage to the entire HOA board with the subject line. Your VP broke into my property. Here's proof. What happened next blew the lid off a problem way bigger than my backyard. Turns out I wasn't the only neighbor Karen had borrowed amenities from without permission. And once the video circulated, others started speaking up. But that wasn't the end, because Karen had one more trick up her sleeve. After the video of Karen scaling my 6-foot privacy fence to swim uninvited in my backyard, the pool went viral among our neighbors. I thought that would be the end of it. I really believed that after being caught on camera trespassing and helping herself to my drinks, Karen would finally back off, but I underestimated how far she was willing to push her fake authority. Instead of laying low or apologizing, she did the unthinkable. She doubled down. The very next morning, taped to my mailbox like some twisted community newsletter, was a laminated notice on fake HOA letterhead declaring that private amenities may be reassigned under emergency heat relief regulations. In that pool, owners are strongly encouraged to participate in a temporary sharing program for neighborhood wellness. No names were signed. No board members were referenced. It was just a bold and absurd claim that she or someone working with her had authority over my private property. I knew immediately it was Karen's doing. It didn't stop there. That afternoon, my neighbor Brian texted me saying that Karen had slipped a similar notice into his door, warning that if he didn't register his grill hours, his patio setup could be subject to a quiet enjoyment violation. I wasn't the only one being targeted. Our entire cul-de-sac was under siege by her fantasy of complete HOA control. My cousin Lisa, who had been with me during the first pool incident, encouraged me to take more serious steps. I already had the footage of her trespassing, so I filed a police report, and though the officers were respectful, they mentioned that misdemeanor trespassing was difficult to prosecute unless she returned. Still, they took my statement and told me to save all documentation. I sent the video to the HOA board, assuming that they'd immediately respond with a reprimand or even consider removing her from her post as vice president. But instead, I was met with silence, total, cowardly silence. None of the board members responded to my email, not even a courtesy acknowledgement. That's when I realized something. Karen wasn't just power-hungry. She had intimidated the entire board into silence, using her position to control the narrative. It made me wonder how long she had been doing this, and how many people had quietly put up with her overreach just to avoid conflict. I decided not to be one of them. I called Angela, one of the newer HOA board members, someone who had always seemed hesitant around Karen, but never openly said anything. At first, she was nervous to talk, asking if I could promise confidentiality, but once I assured her, she opened up. "You're not imagining it," she said. "Karen has been making decisions without board approval for over a year. She writes the newsletters herself. She authorizes violations without votes. And when I tried to push back, she threatened to start a compliance audit on my house. I asked her why no one else spoke up, because she knows where everyone lives," she whispered. "She weaponizes the bylaws. No one wants to deal with the retaliation." It hit me. Then Karen didn't just break rules. She built her own HOA dictatorship and ran it through fear and phony authority. If I wanted to stop her, I'd have to make her own behavior so visible and undeniable that not even the board could protect her anymore. That same evening, I printed out the photos from the security footage, showing her climbing over my fence and swimming in my pool without permission. I taped one to my side gate with a notice beneath it that read, "Private property. Trespassing is a crime. Violators will be prosecuted." I emailed copies to the full HOA board again, this time CCing several neighbors who had already mentioned Karen's odd behavior around their homes. Then I went further. I started knocking on doors. One by one, I visited neighbors and asked them if Karen had ever crossed a line. Most hesitated at first, but as I told my story, their expression shifted. "She walked into my garage without knocking," said one man. "Claimed she thought I was running a business out of it." Another neighbor said she had caught Karen measuring her flower beds with a ruler, muttering about landscaping uniformity. A retired couple showed me photos of Karen peeking over their backyard fence and taking notes. Everyone had a story, and none of them had ever filed a complaint. They were afraid, or more accurately, fed up but too exhausted to challenge her alone. That night, I compiled the testimonies into a shared community folder and emailed it with a new subject line: "Karen's pattern of HOA overreach, time for a vote." Within hours, the neighborhood Facebook group lit up. People were commenting, sharing their own run-ins with Karen, and uploading screenshots of strange notices she had sent. One woman posted a blurry photo of Karen taking a picture of her dog through the front window. Another shared a typed-up noise citation Karen had taped to her door, accusing her of having too cheerful of a wind chime. It was surreal how deep this went. I realized this wasn't just about my pool. It was about someone who thought a small position gave her dominion over other people's homes and lives. By morning, the HOA inbox was flooded. In Franklin, the HOA president, who was notoriously absent from neighborhood matters, finally broke his silence. He sent a neutral but clearly shaken email that read, "The board has received numerous concerns and is currently reviewing internal procedures. A community meeting will be scheduled to address recent incidents." That was the crack I needed. The door had finally opened. Angela called me the next day, her voice both nervous and excited. "You did it," she said. "Franklin's agreed to call a vote to suspend Karen's powers pending investigation, but we need a majority at the meeting." I assured her we'd get it. The neighborhood was buzzing and people were ready. In the meantime, I took extra precautions, adding motion sensors, upgrading the gate lock, and keeping an eye out every time I heard a sound in the yard. Karen hadn't said a word since her failed trespass, but she was watching. I knew it. Lisa texted me one evening saying she saw Karen's car driving slowly past my house 3 times in 1 hour. Another neighbor said Karen had approached him, casually to ask about pool sharing schedules. It was clear she was trying to gauge whether she still had any influence. Then, 2 nights before the HOA meeting, it happened again. My camera caught movement at 2:11 a.m., someone trying to climb the fence. This time it wasn't Karen. It was a teenager, her nephew, as it turned out, later trying to use a step stool to get in. When questioned by police, he claimed aunt. Karen said it was okay, that we could swim there because the HOA owns the pools. It was the last straw. I handed the footage to my attorney, filed another report, and submitted it to the HOA board, along with a statement that made it clear, if they didn't take action, I would pursue legal damages against the entire board. For enabling the harassment, Angela told me the board had called an emergency session. The meeting was set. The neighborhood was ready. and Karen had no idea that her reign of petty tyranny was about to come crashing down in front of everyone. She once controlled, what happened next changed everything. The night of the emergency HOA meeting felt like something out of a courtroom drama. Only instead of judges and lawyers, it was neighbors with clipboards, cell phones, and pent-up frustration finally boiling over. The community center hall, usually half empty and echoing with awkward silences, was packed wall to wall with residents, some standing in doorways, others seated with arms crossed, all of them ready to hold someone accountable. Karen was notably absent from the front table where board members usually sat. Her nameplate had been quietly removed, and the air buzzed with anticipation and whispered questions about whether she'd even show up. At exactly 7:08 p.m., the doors opened, and there she was, dressed in a navy blue pantsuit, sunglasses still on despite the dim room, carrying a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. She walked to the front like she owned the place, sat down next to Franklin, and began unpacking her folder without saying a word. Franklin cleared his throat and began the meeting with what was supposed to be a neutral tone, but even he couldn't hide the unease in his voice. This meeting has been called to address concerns raised by multiple residents regarding potential misconduct by HOA board member Karen Willows. All residents will have the opportunity to speak. The first to stand was Angela, the only board member who had stood up to Karen from the start. Calm and composed, she presented a short statement detailing how Karen had issued unauthorized citations, approved expenditures without a board vote, and trespassed on private properties under the guise of community inspections. She handed out printed documents to those sitting nearby, copies of Karen's fake notices, screenshots from emails, and photos showing Karen trespassing into at least 3 separate backyards. Then she played the now infamous video on the projector. Karen hauling herself over my fence, towel over her shoulder, and doing a casual backstroke in my private pool. The room gasped. A few people chuckled uncomfortably, and one woman near the back whispered, "She really thought she'd get away with that." Karen didn't flinch. When Angela finished and sat down, Karen stood without being prompted and launched into a rambling defensive monologue that would have made a politician blush. She claimed the footage was taken out of context, that she sincerely believed the pool was under shared emergency usage, and that she acted in accordance with HOA health and safety principles during the heat wave. She accused her critics of being emotionally reactive, called Angela uninformed and power-hungry, and warned the board that removing her would lead to chaos and community order. She even claimed she had documentation to prove that pool usage fell under communal amenity classification during what she referred to as thermal distress periods. Franklin looked as if he wanted to disappear into his seat. After Karen's speech, neighbor after neighbor began standing up to share their stories. A middle-aged man from Spruce Lane recounted how Karen once threatened to fine him for leaving his garage door open for longer than 3 minutes. A young mother from Maple Court tearfully explained that Karen had accused her of operating an illegal daycare because her children had friends over. George, the veteran who lived 2 blocks down, described catching Karen taking photos of his backyard shed and reporting it as an unapproved structure, even though it had been there since the house was built. Then Brian stood up and held up a laminated copy of one of Karen's made-up flyers about pool scheduling and waved it like a victory flag. "This isn't about enforcing rules. This is about control. Karen doesn't protect our neighborhood. She terrorizes it." The applause that followed shook the windows. Franklin, finally finding his voice, raised his hand and asked for order. "As president of the board," he said, "I am initiating a vote to suspend Karen Willows from all HOA duties and remove her from the board permanently, pending a community-wide election. This action is supported by Article 9 of our bylaws. All in favor?" Every hand shot up except Karen's. Even to other board members who had remained silent up to this point lifted their hands. Franklin turned toward Karen. "Effective immediately, you are no longer part of this board. You will refrain from using HOA letterhead, issuing communications, or contacting residents in any official capacity." Karen didn't stand. They're frozen for a few seconds, then slowly gathered her binder and stood up with a forced smile. "You've made a grave mistake," she said. "Don't come crying to me when the neighborhood falls apart." And with that, she walked out of the room. A strange silence lingered for a moment after the door shut behind her, but it was quickly replaced by a collective sigh of relief. It felt like a spell had been broken. Just because she'd been removed didn't mean the damage she caused would vanish. The next day, a group of neighbors, including myself, Angela, and Brian, formed a volunteer task force to review past board communications and track all the false violations Karen had issued. It didn't take long to uncover what looked like full-blown fraud. Fake repair invoices signed with unverified company names. Reimbursement forms for community hydration supplies that were never distributed. Even security expenses tied to an LLC registered to Karen's sister. Angela compiled everything into a formal report and turned it over to a local attorney specializing in HOA fraud. That same week, the police began investigating. And that's when we learned Karen had also been running a fake compliance consultancy billing. The HOA, thousands of dollars through ghost companies she controlled. What started as an invasion of my pool turned into the unraveling of a years-long scam. Karen wasn't just an entitled board member, she was an organized manipulator who had used fear, false rules, and silence to turn an entire neighborhood into her personal kingdom. But we had finally taken it back. The county pressed charges: trespassing, harassment, fraud, misuse of community funds. She was arrested quietly one morning at her sister's home. And though her mugshot didn't make national headlines, it certainly made its way around every group chat in Willowbrook Trails. And while most people were just happy she was gone, some of us were still determined to fix the damage she'd left behind. We updated the HOA bylaws to include clearer limits on board power, mandatory transparency for all expenses, and safeguards to prevent any one member from controlling communications. Angela was elected interim president. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, was finally healing. As for my pool, it returned to being what it always should have been: a quiet, personal retreat. But just when I thought the drama had finally ended, I received a certified letter from Karen's attorney, one last desperate move that tried to shift blame and silence me forever. The neighborhood had finally breathed a collective sigh of relief after Karen's public removal and her arrest on multiple charges. But the peace was short-lived, because just as the community began healing, Karen made one final attempt to worm her way back into the story, not through intimidation this time, but manipulation cloaked in civility. It started with a certified envelope left at my door, addressed to me with legal letterhead that bore her attorney's name. The enclosed letter was supposedly a formal apology from Karen, though reading it felt like stepping into a twisted version of events where she painted herself as the misunderstood guardian of the neighborhood rather than the trespasser, who had climbed over my fence and swam in my pool like she owned it. Her words tiptoed around an actual apology, using vague phrases like regretful outcomes and miscommunications with neighbors, while still insinuating that she had every reason to believe the pool was under shared jurisdiction and emergency conditions. She referenced the community bylaws that she had so often twisted in her favor and attempted to justify her actions as noble attempts to protect the neighborhood during record heat. The letter ended with what she called a generous proposal, an offer to settle things privately between us. She proposed covering my legal fees and providing a one-time payment for emotional inconvenience. In exchange for two very specific conditions: I would drop any civil claims I had against her, and more importantly, I would agree not to testify against her in the HOA's formal lawsuit or the county's case. The audacity was staggering. It was a thinly veiled bribe, written on lawyer's paper, designed to silence me with money and make her look cooperative in front of a judge. I didn't hesitate. I forwarded the entire letter to my attorney and also provided it to Angela and the HOA's counsel. The response from the legal team was swift. They flagged it as an unethical attempt to tamper with witnesses and added it to the growing list of evidence being compiled by the prosecution. Karen's move had backfired again, only worsening her case. While the lawyers handled that piece, the neighborhood task force continued digging into all of Karen's past actions. One retired accountant in the community volunteered to audit the HOA's financial records and uncovered more questionable transactions, maintenance fees, for repairs that were never completed. Security upgrades billed at triple market value, and payments made to third-party vendors that turned out to be P.O. boxes. It was like peeling an onion of deception, each layer more rotten than the last. Angela, now the acting president of the board, began organizing what she called restoration meetings. Open forum gatherings where residents could voice concerns, ask questions, and suggest ways to rebuild trust in the HOA. The meetings quickly became popular, drawing dozens of homeowners who had previously never attended anything related to the HOA. They brought coffee, snacks, even lawn chairs, turning what used to be dreaded HOA meetings into neighborhood events. One night, a teen from the neighborhood stood up and shared how Karen once yelled at him for skateboarding on the sidewalk and threatened to report his parents. Another elderly couple admitted they had been scared to plant flowers outside their unit because Karen told them their color scheme violated community standards. Story after story surfaced, painting a complete picture of the fear Karen had instilled under the guise of order. But perhaps the most chilling testimony came from a quiet woman named June, who lived at the far edge of the subdivision. She revealed that Karen had shown up at her house one night after dark, pounding on her door and demanding to see the interior layout because a neighbor allegedly reported non-compliant lighting. Karen had no paperwork, no reason, and no authority, but June let her in because she was too afraid to say no. Her hands trembled as she shared it, and the entire room sat in stunned silence. Angela promised her, and everyone else, that those days were over. Karen's grip was broken, and the community was finally reclaiming itself. Meanwhile, Karen's legal issues began to intensify. The county added witness tampering to her charges after reviewing the settlement letter she sent. Me and her own attorney reportedly distanced himself, citing irreconcilable strategy differences. She retained a new, far less experienced lawyer, who immediately tried to argue that Karen's actions were misguided but non-criminal. The judge, unimpressed, refused to drop any charges. The date for the civil trial was set. Karen no longer dared to show her face in the neighborhood, and her house sat dark and empty. Rumors swirled that she had moved in with a cousin across town, and that she was trying to rent her house under a fake name to avoid confrontation. Of course, that didn't stop her from sending one last message, this time not to me, but to Franklin, the man who had once quietly supported her, and now openly admitted to enabling her out of fear. She sent him an email titled "Final Plea for Redemption," in which she asked him to write a character reference for her court appearance. He shared the email with Angela, who promptly forwarded it to the DAS office. Karen had burned every bridge she'd ever walked on. Still, as surreal as it all was, I tried to return to normal life. I resumed my evening swims, cleaned the patio furniture, and hosted a small neighborhood barbecue to celebrate the reform measures passing. We laughed, we grilled, and we toasted to the community's resilience. Yet I couldn't help glancing toward the fence every so often, expecting a sudden rustle or shadow, a final act of defiance. But none came. What did come, however, was a subpoena, one I'd expected but still found sobering. I would be testifying in court, representing not just myself but every homeowner Karen had intimidated or manipulated. Angela would testify too, along with several others. We were determined to make sure the court saw Karen not as a petty nuisance, but as the calculating fraudster she truly was. As the court date approached, I prepped my statement carefully. I included the emotional distress, the harassment, the intrusions into private space, and the community-wide fear. I submitted the security footage again, the letter she sent with her bribe, copies of every fake notice she had posted around the neighborhood. It was no longer about revenge, it was about accountability. Though I didn't relish seeing her in court, I knew it was necessary. We had come too far to back down now. The final chapter of this wild ride was almost here, and the courtroom was where it would all be decided. Asterisk. The day of Karen's court hearing arrived under gray skies and heavy tension, a fitting atmosphere for the storm that was about to break loose in the courtroom. As I sat on the wooden bench in the gallery, watching Karen enter in a muted gray suit with her new attorney by her side, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of vindication and disbelief. How had it come to this? Just weeks earlier, she had been parading around our neighborhood like a self-appointed queen, drunk on power, trespassing in people's yards and swimming in my pool without permission. And now she looked smaller, her expression tight and rehearsed as if trying to hold on to some last shred of dignity. The courtroom was filled with familiar faces, Angela sitting with her binder of evidence, Franklin quietly adjusting his tie, Brian in the back row with arms folded, and even June, the elderly woman Karen had once harassed at night, clutching a tissue with trembling fingers. The judge took the bench promptly at 9 o'clock, and after the initial formalities, the prosecution began laying out the charges: trespassing, fraud, witness tampering, and misuse of HOA funds. They played the pool footage on a screen for the court, and the room remained eerily silent as Karen's actions played out in crisp black and white. The fence climb, the towel toss, the confident stroll to the deep end, and the unapologetic swim in my pool. Then came her forged notices, the fake consulting payments, and the so-called emergency pool sharing regulations she had invented to justify her actions. The judge listened carefully, asking pointed questions about timelines and documentation. When it was time for witness statements, Angela went first. She spoke clearly and emotionally about the fear, manipulation, and relentless intimidation Karen had imposed on the neighborhood. Then June gave her account, her voice quivering as she recounted the night Karen demanded entry into her home. A hush fell over the courtroom. Then I took the stand. I spoke not just of the trespassing and harassment, but of the way Karen had tried to buy my silence, the stress it caused my family, and the way she had turned a peaceful neighborhood into a prison of her own design. I showed the letter she sent, offering hush money, and reminded the court that her intentions were never to help but to control, intimidate, and profit. Karen's defense lawyer tried to argue that her actions were rooted in a misguided but genuine desire to uphold community standards. But the judge wasn't buying it. He interrupted several times, pressing the attorney on why Karen created false invoices and unauthorized citations. There was no justification for the fraud, and it was clear that even her own lawyer was running out of arguments. By midday, the prosecution rested, and the judge announced that sentencing would follow immediately. His verdict was delivered in a tone as calm as it was final. Karen was found guilty on all counts. She received 6 months probation, was ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA totaling $27,000, was banned from serving on any HOA board for a minimum of 10 years, and was barred from entering any of the private properties she had previously targeted, including mine. The judge emphasized that her actions were not merely misguided, but intentional abuses of power that undermined public trust and personal safety. Karen stood stiffly, her hands clenched, lips pressed so tight they were almost white. Didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't protest. She just stared ahead, hollow-eyed, as her reign officially ended in a courtroom filled with the very neighbors she had once tried to rule. When we walked out of the courthouse, something felt different. It wasn't celebration or gloating, it was relief. A long-held tension had finally been released. People shook hands, embraced, exchanged quiet nods. Angela turned to me and said, "This wasn't just justice for us. It's a warning for every Karen who thinks a clipboard and a title make them untouchable." The weeks that followed were filled with progress. The HOA underwent a full structural audit and implemented new bylaws ensuring no single person could ever seize unchecked power again. The board was now made up of balanced voices from across the neighborhood. Transparency became standard. Monthly meetings were recorded and posted online. Community votes became required for all major decisions, and an anonymous reporting system was introduced to prevent retaliation. Angela was unanimously elected as the permanent HOA president. Under her guidance, the neighborhood felt more united than ever before. Gardens flourished, neighbors laughed together again, kids rode bikes freely, and most importantly, no one feared a knock at the door demanding they justify their wind chimes or patio chairs. As for Karen, her house was quietly sold at the end of the summer. A moving truck showed up one morning, and by noon, the place was empty. No one saw her that day. She disappeared without farewell, without a final word, without the chance to spin her version of the story one more time. The legend of Karen faded quickly, replaced by a community that had learned the importance of standing up. speaking out and protecting one another from those who abuse power. The pool, once the center of the storm, returned to its peaceful rhythm. It became a symbol of what had been taken and what had been reclaimed. I still swim there often, and every time I dip into the water, I remember what it took to restore peace, not just in my yard, but in our entire community. We had faced a nightmare dressed as neighborhood leadership and came out stronger for it. To anyone watching or listening now, let this be your lesson. No title gives someone the right to control your life. No one has the authority to invade your space or silence your voice. Stand up. Speak out. Fight back, because communities don't belong to Karens. They belong to the people who live in them. And if you want more true stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, where real drama meets real justice. One jaw-dropping tale at a time.